Our next speaker is a dear friend and someone who does tremendous work in communities and interacting with people, particularly in Chicago, but also around the country, but does even more fascinating work inside people's heads, diving into and peering into really how children learn and think and grow. Dr. Stanley Howard is the founder and president of the Law and Civics Reading and Writing Institute, an education think tank whose mission is to conduct interdisciplinary research on children's development and learning, especially at-risk children of color. He has a PhD in political science, specializing in civil rights, civil liberties, and the U.S. Constitution. Over the past 5 years, he has cross-pollinated the study of political science with the fields of early childhood development and learning. Dr. Howard attended Northern Illinois University, receiving a BA in political science and a minor in African American studies. He has a master's degree and PhD in political science from the University of Illinois Chicago, where he specialized in public policy analysis. Dr. Howard is the author of the newly released, and remember this title, Righting America's Wrongs, a best practices manual for educating black male youth. Righting America's Wrongs, a best practices manual for educating black male youth. He lives in Chicago with his wife, Anita, who's an early childhood educator and coach. And I should say, my wife, Michelle Dubois, shout out to Michelle right here, is a brilliant woman. I would be walking into walls and off cliffs if it wasn't for her, both metaphorically and literally. And much of what she learned, particularly in college, undergrad at DePaul University, particularly as it relates to the world around her, issues of race and reconciliation and politics, she learned from Dr. Howard, who was her professor at DePaul at the time, which is where they initially connected, and he's become a dear friend and a national leader on these subjects. So please welcome up Dr. Stanley Howard. Clicker?
No, actually, the table in the middle. Oh,
yeah, watch your feet.
I don't want to roam a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
You want a clicker, so I want. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Is that okay?
All right. So
okay. All right. Right. So this is. Actually, I'm not.
You're not good? Okay. Cool. You're fine.
I want to clear something with the voices. I know I have 9 minutes. And so if you're going to hold me to that, I'm not going to say what I want to say prior to that. So you have to give me license. You can't hear me? All right, can you hear me now? I asked for license before I start. I want to talk about what's been my experience here over the last couple of days, real quickly, and then I'll get into my talk. In 1967, really quick, my mother in 1967 my mother and father had, I think at that time, about 11 of us, right? And in Chicago, and she decided that she had had enough of, we were in a Baptist church, she had had enough of Christians. She says that, and she had been in church since she was a baby. She had had enough. She says, that's it. She said, they're not really concerned about justice, not really, they're not serious about justice. And she was very despondent, very upset, I can recall. I was about maybe 10 or 11 years of age. And so we left the church. She would talk about how Dr. King would make the point, and Ann and I were just talking about this rather amazing person, Ann Nunn. Ann, are you here? Incredible how, well, she would talk about how Dr. King says that the most segregated place on Sunday is the church, right? So she was upset. And she was upset that when he came to Chicago, he was treated so horrifically, right? So we left the church, but we didn't leave Christ. We didn't leave Christ, but she would say, be Christ-like, but the Christians you can't trust. And so we had, I'm giving you what she said, right? And so we as children, we were confused as to what we ought to do, obviously. And so, but what she emphasized most of all is that don't leave Christ, always follow Christ, but be careful of the Christians. Now, I'm saying that because the experience I have had over the last couple of days has done a lot to settle my soul. It's absolutely wonderful to talk with people who are, in fact, doing good work, and they call themselves Christians. They love Christ. They love the work of Christ. They love the principles of Christ. And so here I am listening to jars of clay. Someone who grew up with the Temptations, right? Jars of clay and loving it. I mean, it sounds very, very good, really good, and just some of the lyrics. So anyway, I wanted to share that with you because my experience is not very atypical. It's a lot of folk who have left over the years, especially during the height of the civil rights movement, left because they felt that they had no home in their churches because they weren't doing good social justice work. So I just want to say that first of all. Done. Okay. So, I want to frame I'm not good with this. I usually have a clip and stuff. Am I all right? Because I started walking. I'm a kinesthetic learner. I want to frame this, I want us to look at this question of unfinished civil rights business, okay? I want us to rethink, reimagine, we've used those words often today, rethink and reimagine unfinished civil rights business, right? And so I want to talk about that in the context of a story. Sorry for the story. My mother and I are sowing vegetable seeds. And she turns to me and she says, son, if you want rich and bountiful harvest, then you sow a set of seeds for God. You got to do three things. She said, my mother told me this, and I'm going to share with you. Sow a set of seeds for God, sow a set of seeds for yourself, your family, and members of your village. And then she says, sow a set of seeds for the animals. I obeyed my mother's advice, and as a result, had amazing vegetables. One day, one season, I went into my garden and I sowed a set of seeds for God. I sowed a set of seeds for myself, my family, and members of my village. And then I went quickly into the house, propped my feet up on an end table, and began watching Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. A week later, I go into the garden, and I wanted to see the progress, but there was no progress. There was chaos. I'm fairly sure I saw some destruction, right? I'm definitely sure that I saw a crime scene. I mean, my favorite vegetable in the whole world is kale. My kale had been ravaged, had been decimated. From afar, I can see the culprits. A band of criminals vegetable game banging, trespassing, thug, rabbits had invaded my garden. So, what am I going to do? I say, okay, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm gonna call my Uncle Joe. Call Uncle Joe. Now, Uncle Joe, who incidentally just celebrated his 100th birthday about 4 months ago, Uncle Joe, besides that, is a hunter of small game with a sharpshooter's eye. And I said to myself, yeah, there's going to be some bloodshed today. These rabbits, these game bangers, have invaded my garden, got to be some bloodshed. Now, I'm happy to report that I did retrieve my senses. I did not call my Uncle Joe, but what I did do is I looked deeper into the story to find the moral. And this is what I came up with this. Unfinished business carries consequences, and particularly for the children. Okay, so fine. Simple, plain, a message that is true, right? Let's do the Michael Jackson. A message that's true. And it took me to this message, this statement, this official statement. We have made great progress in the nation on civil rights, but there remains unfinished business. We still have unfinished business. I've never honored and respected that term, personally. I always looked at the term as being undemocratic. I mean, no responsible democracy could ever utter such language, I said. It smells of surrender. At any rate, the language seems sterile to me, antiseptic, void of any real power to transform, heal. As a matter of fact, it's been my American experience that when the term has been used, it has been used more to silence freedom cries than to facilitate their free reign. So, if that's the case, then what about unfinished business that creates that? Well, I think we would have to go to the question of finished civil rights business to get a clue about that, right? The finished civil rights business that's well defined. It is seared into our collective American imagination. At some point in our nation's history, can you still hear me? I have to keep this up here, right? At some point in our nation's history, we're going to have to define. We're going to have to honor the promise the civic promise of shared values. Shared values, shared interests, and a shared destiny. However, to do that, we have to define unfinished business of civil rights. We have to make that definition. And we have to define that term from the standpoint of Black Americans, especially children, and the problems that they're having in the area of economics, education, and especially criminal justice. But this definition has to be, we have to be careful that in defining these terms, that we make sure we are defining them from the standpoint of suffering children and what their needs are. Now, the only way, how do you get there? Well, first you have to be honest about what the children are experiencing. They are experiencing, in many cases, intergenerational traumas. And this is something that we don't really want to talk about, but we have to. And I think that we need to have the voices of some icons to help us in these collective conversations. Obviously, Harriet, indomitable Harriet Tubman. And so we mentioned over and over, I've heard it a few times here, that Harriet said after she was lauded for the work that she had done in freeing the slaves, she says, I would have freed more had they known that they were slaves. Now that's a profoundly spiritual understanding. And is it only relevant to African Americans? Absolutely not. It is relevant to all people, especially struggling Americans. I would have freed more had they known they were slaves. Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick said something about children that I think is very, very important for us to listen to. He says that, and this is before neuroscience, brain research that validated what he said in the 1850s, I believe. He says that it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. Now think about that from the standpoint of our pathological obsession with mass incarceration. I call Fannie Lou Hamer the resiliently impatient warrior. And in the best spirit of scientific civics, she says that simply, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. Can't get no better than that. And of course, Dr. King, the incomparable Dr. King. What did Dr. King say that could help us in our connecting conversations? He said that there comes a time when silence is betrayal. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's give it up for Dr. Stan Howard. Thank you so much. Comes a time when silence is betrayal. Calling out these names that have meant so much, but sometimes we just gloss over them and don't really understand what they stood for in practice. And so I hope we'll go back and learn more about Harriet Tubman and Fannie Lou Hamer and certainly Dr. King and other freedom fighters.